The Shadows of Elm Street, A Legacy Unbound. 1. The invitation. It all started with an unassuming email. The subject line read, "Unlock the mystery of your childhood home." As I stared at my screen, a rush of memories flooded back. Elm Street, where I grew up, was a place I hadn't thought about in years. The email was from a name I didn't recognize, Mrs. Harrington. She claimed to be a distant relative who had inherited the house after my family left. Her request was simple yet compelling: come visit and explore what's left of the house before it's sold. My initial reaction was skepticism, but something about the message felt urgent, almost pleading. A quick search of her name led me to a sparse Facebook profile with a picture of a kind-looking elderly woman. Against my better judgment, I replied. Within an hour, she responded with the address, a phone number, and a date: Friday, at dusk. I couldn't resist the pull of nostalgia and curiosity. 2. A return to Elm Street. Friday arrived quicker than expected. As I drove down the winding road that led to Elm Street, and he settled in, the neighborhood had changed, or maybe it hadn't. It was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. The house stood at the end of the street, its frame sagging under the weight of years. Mrs. Harrington greeted me at the door. She was smaller than I imagined, her frailty accentuated by the oversized cardigan she wore. But her eyes, sharp and piercing, betrayed a mind that missed nothing. "You've grown into your father's features," she said, her voice gravelly. She led me inside, where the air felt dense, almost heavy. The house was a museum of my childhood: faded wallpaper, cracked tiles, and the unmistakable scent of aged wood. But there was something else, a faint metallic tang in the air. Mrs. Harrington's expression shifted as she noticed my reaction. "Don't mind the smell. The basement has a history of moisture," she said, avoiding my gaze. Point 3. The locked door. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Harrington shared stories about the house, most of which felt unfamiliar. She spoke of strange occurrences and hinted at tragedies I had no recollection of. But it was the locked door at the end of the hallway that captured my attention. "What's behind it?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just storage," she replied quickly, too quickly. Her hand trembled as she placed her teacup down. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying her stories and the unease in her voice. Around midnight, I decided to investigate. The door was locked, as expected, but the hinges were old and rusty. With a little force, it creaked open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. A faint sound, like a whisper, seemed to come from below. For echoes of the past. Basement was a time capsule. Dust-covered furniture, boxes of old photos, and toys I hadn't seen in decades were scattered across the room. But one corner drew my attention, a small table with a mirror above it. The glass was cracked, distorting my reflection. Beneath it was a diary with my name on the cover. Flipping through its pages, I found entries I didn't remember writing. They spoke of a shadowy figure, the Watcher, who visited me at night. My handwriting grew erratic as the entries progressed, filled with frantic pleas to leave the house. A sudden noise broke my concentration. Footsteps. I froze, clutching the diary. The footsteps stopped just above the stairs. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. 5. Confrontation. Next morning, Mrs. Harrington's demeanor had changed. She seemed more cautious, her sentences clipped. When I confronted her about the diary, her face paled. "You weren't supposed to see that," she whispered, her voice cracked with emotion. "Your parents tried to protect you from the truth." "What truth?" I demanded, the frustration boiling over. She hesitated before finally speaking. "The house has a presence, something your family's always been tied to. They thought leaving would break the connection, but it's stronger than that." Her words felt absurd, but the events of the previous night were hard to dismiss. As I pressed her for more details, she revealed that the house's original owner had been a reclusive man rumored to dabble in dark rituals. Over the years, strange accidents and disappearances plagued anyone who lived there. 6. The final night. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to stay one last night. Armed with a flashlight and the diary, I returned to the basement. This time, I noticed symbols etched into the walls, faint but unmistakable. The air grew colder, As I traced them with my fingers, suddenly, the mirror on the table shattered, and a deafening noise filled the room. A shadowy figure emerged, its form shifting and unnatural. Panic surged through me as I stumbled back. The diary fell from my hands, its pages flipping wildly. The figure paused, its gaze fixed on the book. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. The figure raised a hand, and the room fell silent. 7. Leaving Elm Street next morning, I packed my things and left without saying goodbye to Mrs. Harrington. The diary was gone, as were the symbols in the basement. But the memories of that night stayed with me. Weeks later, I received another email from Mrs. Harrington. It was brief: "The house is sold. May its new owners find peace." I never replied. Some doors are better left closed. 8. The new owners. Months later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove by Elm Street to see the house. To my surprise, a family had already moved in. The father, tall and broad-shouldered, was unloading furniture from a truck. The mother, her hair tied back, waved at neighbors who cautiously avoided eye contact. A young boy clutched a stuffed animal, looking up at the house with wide eyes. The sight filled me with dread, but I couldn't bring myself to warn them. 9. A fractured family. Weeks passed, and reports about the new family began circulating. Neighbors whispered about arguments echoing late at night and strange lights flickering in the windows. The mother was rarely seen, and the boy had stopped attending school. Rumors grew darker: disappearance. The family dog found lifeless on the porch. Elm Street's quiet unease deepened. 10. A call for help. On the evening, I received a frantic call. It was the father of the new family. "You lived here," he said, his voice trembling. "You know what this house is, don't you?" I hesitated. Before answering, he begged me to come over and help. Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing this might be my chance to confront the house's secrets once and for all. 11. The gathering arrived to find the house in chaos. The mother was missing, and the boy refused to speak, clutching the same stuffed animal I'd seen before. The father, disheveled and desperate, led me to the basement. He pointed to a wall where new symbols had appeared, glowing faintly in the dim light. 12. And veiling the ritual as we examined the symbols, a loud thud echoed upstairs. The father and I raced up to find the boy staring at the mirror in the hallway. "He's here," the boy whispered. The reflection in the mirror was not ours, but a grotesque figure that grinned menacingly. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered. 13. Allies are desperate for answers. I called Mrs. Harrington. To my surprise, she arrived within the hour, carrying a worn leather book. "I've prepared for this," she said. Together, we devised a plan to confront the entity. 14. The ritual begins with Mrs. Harrington's guidance. We began a ritual to banish the entity. Candles flickered as she chanted in an ancient tongue. The symbols on the walls pulsed, and the shadowy figure reappeared, resisting our efforts. 15. The sacrifice entity demanded something in return for leaving. Mrs. Harrington offered herself, stepping forward bravely. As the ritual reached its climax, the entity dissolved into smoke, and the house fell silent. 16. Aftermath. Family moved out immediately, and I never saw them again. The house stood empty, its windows dark and lifeless. I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't truly over. 17. A new beginning. Years later, I learned the house had been demolished. In its place was a park, filled with laughter and life. Though the past lingered in my memories, I found peace in knowing the cycle had ended. Or so I hoped. 18. Whispers in the dark. Just when I thought I had moved on, I began receiving anonymous letters. They spoke of the house's essence being relocated. A part of me wanted to investigate, but the fear of reopening old wounds held me back. I burned the letters, but the unease lingered. 19. The Elm Street Circle. Months later, I learned of a secret society formed around the house's history. They called themselves the Elm Street Circle and claimed to be protectors of its dark legacy. I infiltrated one of their meetings, posing as an interested researcher. What I found chilled me to the bone. They had artifacts from the house, including the mirror and the diary. 20. The final confrontation. Society's leader, a man named Victor Graves, revealed that the entity had been summoned intentionally They believed it held the key to immortality. As I tried to reason with them, the entity reappeared, drawn by the artifacts. Chaos erupted as members of the circle were attacked. In the chaos, I grabbed the diary and mirror, knowing they had to be destroyed. To 1. The destruction of the artifacts. With the help of a historian I befriended, we devised a plan to destroy the artifacts. We traveled to an ancient site known for breaking curses. As the mirror shattered and the diary burned, a deafening roar echoed, and the ground shook. The entity appeared one last time, but its form was weak and flickering. With a final chilling scream, it vanished. To 2. Peace at last. For the first time in years, I felt a weight lifted. The house, the entity, and its dark legacy were gone for good. I returned to Elm Street one last time to find the park flourishing. Children laughed, and the air was light. It was over, truly over. The lingering shadow. Despite the peace I felt, whispers of unease began to creep into my mind. Nightmares plagued my sleep, visions of the entity appearing at the edge of my consciousness. One dream stood out: Elm Street bathed in darkness, the park replaced by the house, its windows glowing red. A voice echoed, soft but menacing, "You may have destroyed the vessel, but I endure." When I woke, the weight of those words lingered. I pushed the feeling aside, determined to leave it all behind, but a nagging thought remained: could it truly be over? A familiar echo. Weeks later, I received an email. The subject line was eerily familiar: "Unlock the mystery of Elm Street." My hands trembled as I opened it. The message was simple: "You didn't end it. Come see for yourself." It included an address, but not Elm Street. This time, it pointed to a small, abandoned church outside of town. Against my better judgment, I went. The church was in ruins, its walls covered in graffiti. At the altar, I found a small box wrapped in chains. A note attached read, "For your eyes only." I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a charred fragment of the mirror and a page from the diary, the ink smeared but still legible. The single sentence sent chills down my spine: "The essence has found a new home." The forgotten family. Digging into the origins of the entity, I discovered something I had missed before. The original owner of the house, the man who performed the rituals, had descendants who were still alive. One family member, an elderly man named Samuel Harrington, lived in a remote cabin. He was Mrs. Harrington's estranged brother. When I visited him, he seemed to know why I had come. "The curse isn't bound to a place," he said, his voice shaking. "It follows those who seek it, feeds on their curiosity. You've carried a piece of it with you all along." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What can I do?" I asked, desperate for answers. Samuel's face grew grim. "You have to sever your connection. Destroy the last fragments and erase every trace." The ritual of severance. With Samuel's guidance, I gathered what remained of the artifacts and prepared for a final ritual. We returned to the ancient site where I had destroyed the mirror and diary. This time, we brought additional tools: salt circles, runes, and an obsidian dagger Samuel claimed was essential to cutting the tie. As the ritual began, the air grew dense, and a shadow formed. More menacing than before, it lashed out, its anger palpable. The fragments glowed red-hot as Samuel chanted incantations in a forgotten language. I felt an unbearable pressure, as though the entity was trying to pull me into its grasp. With a final cry, Samuel plunged the dagger into the center of the fragments. A deafening scream filled the air, and the shadow dissolved into nothingness. The silence that followed was absolute. Closure. In the weeks that followed, I felt a profound sense of relief. The nightmares ceased, and the constant weight I hadn't even realized I carried lifted. Elm Street became a distant memory, and for the first time, I allowed myself to hope. I visited the park one last time. It was late afternoon, and the golden sunlight bathed the area in warmth. Children played, and the air smelled of flowers. As I sat on a bench, I noticed something carved into the wood: "To those who dare, beware the shadows." A warning, or perhaps a reminder. Either way, I smiled, knowing the chapter was finally